Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 11, Episode 9. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In the news this week, we're talking more tariff turmoil, earnings news on the luxury front, as well as Tractor Supply signals a broader consumer slowdown, and some concerning job numbers. Now, we're sans guest this week, as we do from time to time. We're going to go deep on a topic that we believe has deep relevance for leaders who are navigating disruption. It's a concept that Steve calls blank canvas strategy, and it just might be what both struggling brands and those that want to leap ahead of the competition need right here, right now.
Yes, if you're worried that the planet you are currently living on might be growing increasingly uninhabitable, you'll want to stay tuned. And then after that discussion, we'll be back with what we found most remarkable this week, as well as what's on our radar screen for the weeks ahead.
Now, you're back on the road, or should I say on an airplane next week?
Yes, I'll be heading, actually, it's really 2 weeks from now, the second week of November, I'll be in London. So I'll be checking out some remarkable retail there and doing some other more secretive things. So look forward to some content coming out of that, as well as if you're around and you want to catch up, let me know.
All right, let's get to news of the week. The Blue Jays are playing the LA Dodgers in the World Series, and as it happens, we have a bit of Canadian tariff news with the Trump announcing he's discontinuing trade discussions with Canada. What's your impression, and what do you think it means to the retailers listening?
Well, I guess who the heck knows? It's just more examples of the volatility, I guess. You know, when the toddler in chief has a tantrum, things come to a halt. And I'm always hesitant, as we've probably said 5 or 6 times now this year, to talk about tariffs, because we talk about them and then something changes very quickly. I guess by the time many people will listen to this, Trump will supposedly have met with President Xi about China. There's some news that maybe India tariffs are coming down, tied up in the Russian-Ukrainian thing. So just a lot going on. But I guess as our resident Canadian, how are you feeling about this from the other side of the border?
Well, I mean, we don't believe in coincidences. This ad's been running for a while. And just for the background, this ad is run and paid for by the province of Ontario, which is feeling a lot of pressure and stress with basically the announcement that America is going to take back all the auto parts, auto manufacturing, which is a huge part of the Ontario economy. So Ontario's got a big stake in the game with many provinces. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're not talking about the destruction of a third of the White House now on the major news networks. We're talking about this Canadian thing. So we're interrupting regular news with some more news, which I think the Trump administration is very, very good at, of changing the narrative and moving the narrative away.
Flood the zone.
Well, and it's even more tactical than that. I mean, there's some lessons to be learned here, right? If you want to change the narrative, they must have just a long laundry list. Because like I said, this ad's been running for weeks, right? So it's a matter of when do we what have we got in the cupboard to pull out and change the narrative about whatever happens to be happening. So anyway, listen, to the degree there are any trade negotiations happening in the context of our free trade agreement, we're actually in a pretty good place, right? The Canadians and Mexicans were in a pretty good place in terms of our trade. 80% of our trade is free trade protected, but there's big concerns for the Canadian economy, between softwood lumber and auto manufacturing. If that goes away, what does it mean for the Canadian economy? And let's take a minute and understand why cars are made in Canada and Mexico to begin with, not just America, because that's what made us as an industry competitive to the Europeans or the Japanese at the time. So we'll see in the fullness of time, maybe 10 years, if this happens, what happens to that. But anyway, it's just another day in trade news is kind of the way we're thinking. It's also distraction, puts the downer on the. That's right. It's also a distraction. It also happens to be the day we're recording this on Friday. Comes out the day the Jays are playing the Dodgers in the first game of the World Series. So maybe there's a bit of extra juju there that he wants to throw against the Canadian team. But anyway.
Well, as I told some fellow Canadians that you would be quite familiar with on a call earlier this week that wanted to talk a lot about baseball, and we're very curious where my loyalties lie. I said, I do not care at all really about baseball, though. Little fun fact, my older daughter was in high school with Clayton Kershaw. So, I guess if I want to be a little bit more of a homer, it's a little bit more tied to high school connection as opposed to the U.S. versus Canada. But anyway.
Fun. Anyway, we'll see where that all trades out, so to speak. Let's move on. A bit of earning news to cover off. Not a lot, but some footprints in the sand, some signals. What did you? Let's talk about it. What did you make of it?
Yeah, actually, this coming week, the week we're talking about now, is huge for earnings for broader industrial companies and tech companies. So that might have a bigger effect on kind of the broader brush for the consumer confidence and just general macroeconomic gyrations. But a couple of interesting earnings bits this week. So Hermes and Kering, so many people know Kering is one of the big luxury holding companies, Gucci being the primary brand there, both came out with their earnings this week. Hermes continues to be one of the most remarkable performing brands on the planet. Sales up nearly 10% against a backdrop of a luxury industry that's been pretty stalled. On the less bad side, and later on in the episode, we'll talk about another less bad set of earnings, but Kering was down only, in one way of looking at it, 10%. That is a definite improvement in trend. They have a new CEO. There's some optimism around Gucci kind of getting its footings, but I don't know. To me, it's a little bit hard to say that 10% is a great result, but if you've been down 20, 25%, it is definitely an improvement in trend. So I think this whole polarization of outcomes in luxury continues to be super interesting. And we may have an episode coming up where we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. The other one that I thought was super interesting, which is not exactly retail, but kind of retail adjacent, was large, very famous Mattel, the toy manufacturer, had a very bad report. And what was particularly interesting about it is the main reason they had such a bad quarter and surprised a lot of people was they reported that their shipments were down considerably because retailers basically were holding on their orders in light of pricing and consumer demand. So their quarter just ended in September. So that's pretty close in to when you expect retailers would be taking shipments to get on the floor as we are, just coming into the heart of the holiday season. So it was unclear whether they expected that that would improve quickly or whether or not this could portend a pretty troubling holiday season. But of course, Mattel, very specific in the toy industry, and as many people would know, the vast majority of toys come from China, where the tariffs are extremely high. So I don't know exactly what to read into that, but it was certainly much worse than many people were anticipating. Back into the more core of retail, one of our favorite retailers, Tractor Supply, continues to perform well. Their quarter, strong sales performance, strong profit performance, but they warned that they expected the next quarter to not be so rosy. They lowered their guidance to comp store sales only increasing about 2%. So that is less than the broader industry average, less than where inflation seems to be, and they expected their earnings to be basically flat. And I think I'm not sure how explicit they were about this, but I think that the suggestion was this is when tariffs are really going to start to affect it. And I was just going to mention really briefly just this morning, Deckers, the big footwear brand, came out, and we may have a former Deckers executive on the pod in just a couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. But Deckers owns UGG boots, and the growth vehicle for them there is the HOKA brand, which has been on fire. Well, they said they expect sales and earnings to slow down a lot in the next quarter. So I think here we're starting to see both this concern about consumer demand, at least in the more mainstream kind of brands, as well as potentially more impact from tariffs starting to hit in this next quarter, maybe not so much in the current quarter, because that's definitely been a very mixed bag.
We had some job news, and not official job news as in statistics, but we had several announcements that point to, in one way, the sound of inevitability, technology replacing people, but in other ways, perhaps points us in a direction of a slowdown or certainly a restructuring. Take us off the top, and let's start with Target.
Yeah, it seems to be a mix of things. I do think it's, in Target's case, so that was a big piece of news. They are eliminating, I think it's about 8% of their corporate jobs. That's a pretty significant percentage. On the one hand, not a huge surprise, as we've talked about multiple times, and probably many people would know, Target's business has been incredibly soft. They've got a new CEO coming in. Not uncommon for a new CEO to come in and make some big changes. Maybe we'll see some store counts or store shifts after the holidays. So I think it's a pretty bad look, though. And we talked about this when the new CEO was named. Brian Cornell has been the CEO for a number of years. He's really the guy who's been at the helm that has led to some of these restructuring moves, and he's sticking around as the chairman. So I don't know. I really think that it's pretty shameful that the board is allowing him to stay around. And here you've got big job reductions right before the holidays, and perhaps some more that might come early next year. So anyway, not surprising, but pretty significant. Kind of related in the consumer space, there's a lot of other big corporates that announced some pretty significant headcount reductions last week. P&G, Nestle, General Motors. So again, I think this speaks
Nestle was huge, by the way. What was Nestle? 12 or 16,000 people globally. Like it's a huge. Yeah,
there's some others. I won't go through all of them, but how much of this is consumer slowdown? How much of this is trying to offset tariff impact? How much of this is AI? Difficult to say. The other one, which is a little bit of a longer term thing, I think we talked several months ago about Andy Jassy at Amazon, their CEO, talking about the impact of technology on how work would change. Well, specifically, Amazon last week announced that because of their increasing deployment of robots, they expected to eliminate up to 600,000 jobs over the next several years. So that's not nothing. But of course, Amazon, very technology forward, not only with robotics, but AI and other automation. So it's I don't want to suggest we're going into a dystopian future, but this is not definitely the most optimistic set of news we've had to share in the last few months.
Well, a couple of quick comments. I mean, Amazon, going into the holidays, they always put out a big announcement about how many people they're going to hire. And I think this year was 250,000. I mean, these numbers are just kind of mind-blowing, likely very, 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 very large. I think we were talking about we almost create a new segment here. This week in ChatGPT, this week in agentic retail. And it's not like a small little thing. Wow, there's a huge news. It seems like a weekly occurrence. So take us through it.
I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit because one of my predictions was that we would see a very dramatic change in the nature of search and a bit more evidence on this. But I feel like we may be back to this topic almost every week. ChatGPT moved into second place behind Amazon in its position with product search. So I don't want to go too deep on this because there's definitional issues as opposed to sort of generalized search where people are asking questions of Google. But where you're really on a product hunt mission, most searches don't start at Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever, but they start on Amazon, and then you go down to other retailers, Walmart, et cetera. But ChatGPT has moved from basically nowhere to the second position. It's quite, I don't know if it's shocking, but it's certainly quite dramatic. So huge increase in a very short period of time. Now, conversion is still quite low. So, we're not seeing this translate necessarily to sales. Now, some of this is probably driven out of curiosity as more people are experimenting with ChatGPT, and this is a thing you can do. Some of this may speak to it's not optimized very well in a way that obviously Amazon is extremely well optimized for conversion. So I wouldn't, totally be hair on fire about this if you're a retailer or if you're at Google, but it's pretty interesting. So I think that's definitely something to watch. And I've spoken to a few retailers that have seen some of their traffic drop or traffic growth slow down quite a lot. And I have a thought that this might be part of the explanation.
I wonder, Steve, if there's a little bit of good news in there. In other words, is it good for retailers that people start going to other places to start their search journey than Amazon? Right? So maybe there's the silver lining to this kind of news.
Yeah, it's unclear how this is all going to sort out, but I can tell you this is going to be a huge topic of conversation in the months and perhaps years ahead. The other thing, just quickly on OpenAI, is they launched a browser called Atlas, and so to the extent we thought Google had a total lock on much of this stuff, maybe not so much.
All right, well, that's the news of the week. Now let's bridge over into our blank canvas strategy discussion. All right, so as we teased off the top, we're discussing this concept today of a blank canvas strategy. Why this topic and why now?
Oh, well, in some ways I've been thinking about this as kind of a continuation from some of the work I've been doing, which you can see, well, you can hear about on the podcast sometimes, but you definitely see in Remarkable Retail and Leaders Leap. But, it kind of comes back to this idea we've touched on a few times, which is I continue to see the world changing very, very much, but I also continue to see many brands, many retailers changing very little, or maybe not nearly as much as they need to. And longtime listeners may know, or readers of Leaders Sleep would know, that I refer to this as the trap of the timid transformation, or engaging in infinite incrementalism. And ultimately, that is not where they need to get to. So I guess I'm growing more passionate about this topic and a sense of urgency, maybe for a few reasons. One is, the pace of disruption is only increasing. We talk about this all the time in the news, just the kind of breathtaking pace of disruption. And so this idea of retailers needing to aim higher in the value they deliver and move faster, because if they don't, it's incredibly easy to fall further and further behind. Second, as we often have talked about a lot this year, the bifurcation of outcomes is becoming more pronounced. So there's only a few brands that are doing really, really well. But frankly, most retailers by number, maybe not by total sales, are either already in pretty serious trouble, or they're basically treading water, or they're very clearly getting closer and closer to the precipice, which means you've got to change a lot. And then, as we look at some of these transformation strategies, most of them aren't really getting anywhere. And, aside from maybe there needs to be better execution or different investment or whatever, I think a lot of that is they haven't articulated a compelling end game or a plan that is an exciting destination that has any real chance of success. So I guess before we get further into it, I want to just maybe make a distinction here about blank canvas strategy compared to blue ocean strategy, which I imagine many people in our audience would be familiar about.
By the way, thanks for doing that, because the comparison is when I first read your notes and we started talking about this, I immediately went to blue ocean strategy. So it is a different thing. And you tell us about the distinctive difference, because I think it's really, once you articulate, it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some ideas from blue ocean strategy that are relevant to this, and we're not going to go super deep in the time we have, but blue ocean strategy is mostly about finding new white space for growth. So finding those places that are, kind of unfished parts of the water, right? Blank canvas strategies, I think about it, is really responding to disruption in your core business. And in some cases, it's about how to survive that disruption. But of course, hopefully, we're able to thrive in the face of it. So one is really, totally new lands. Blank canvas strategy is really about trying to find a place to occupy, which might create new growth opportunities, but it's mostly about addressing challenges in your core business.
So we're not going to go too deep on this in this kind of survey episode, but let's dig in on some of the basics. So what do you mean by a blank canvas strategy in the context of the way you're thinking about it?
Yeah, so first of all, to your point, I think we're going to talk more about the what and the why, not too much about the how in this episode. So just to manage people's expectations and try to get through this in a manageable amount of time. So at one level, it probably is somewhat easy to understand, or a familiar concept, this idea of having a blank canvas, right? Where you're starting with kind of nothing and starting to populate it. Now, of course, what I see is most people's strategies have a starting point. This is the business we're in, and let's look how we move forward from that kind of fixed point. This is really more opening the aperture and trying to rethink a remarkable strategic position you'd like to attain. The how gets a little bit into time frame, so I won't go too deep on this. But I think fundamentally, it's really saying, let's be unencumbered. Let's blow up the way we currently think about the business in terms of the legacy assets, current resources, the real estate, perhaps if you're a physical retailer. But also at the same time, let's say, well, what we could do, though, if we want, is leverage or amplify or perfect what does work in our favor. So it's kind of like, let's let go of the things that keep us stuck or major obstacles to overcome, and let's just be a little bit more free associative about what we can bring in more of an idealized state. So, many people, we talk about blue ocean strategy, and a lot of other people will be familiar with the innovator's dilemma or this idea of disrupting yourself. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit to say, let's kind of free yourself, at least initially, of some of that baggage, some of those constraints.
We'll be right back after these messages. Promotional support for the show comes from Find Mine. In the time it takes to listen to this ad, your team could have leveled up their productivity by 90% and set up your brand for increased sales. Find Mine's AI tools let you run operations on thousands of products right now. Get self-service AI to support product tagging for better success with AI agents, dynamic programmatic ads for Meta, visually similar product recs, complete the look styling, trend and campaign curations. Find Mine's innovative enterprise platform currently generates breakthrough customer experiences for top brands like Lululemon and Ann Taylor. See what Find Mine can do for you and join the waitlist at findmine.com/remarkable retail. If the world has changed so very, very much, why have so many organizations changed so little? As the pace of disruption accelerates, leaders need the courage and the insight to aim higher in the value they deliver, move faster than they ever have before, and take the bold action to leap ahead of the competition. With Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, Steve's latest breakthrough bestseller, you'll discover why so many companies fall into the trap of the timid transformation. More than anything, you'll learn about the essential mind leaps leaders need to make to win the future. Leaders Leap is available just about everywhere books are sold, as well as on Audible and as an ebook on Kindle for just $9.99. Now, as retailers and listeners are listening, so to speak, to the episode, and they're thinking about reflecting on blue ocean strategy versus a blank canvas strategy, who's this for? Who's a candidate for a blank canvas strategy amongst the folks who are listening to us and everyone else?
Well, for sure, if you are struggling, you're a candidate. But the other way I think about it is, are you in a business that is at or rapidly approaching its expiration date? So, we can think about lots of businesses, and maybe we'll talk about in a minute, some of the businesses that have gone through this over the past couple of decades or are going through it right now. But if your business model is at significant risk, or you can see on the horizon, it may be at significant risk, for sure, you fit with that. But I think it's also worth being a bit paranoid, because one thing we know for sure is even very successful retailers often find themselves in quite a lot of trouble. Now, historically, that's happened over a longer period of time. But as the pace of disruption becomes more pronounced and accelerates, it might be a little bit easier to imagine that you might be in trouble. So I think being a little bit paranoid is helpful, and it's a good exercise. It may just not be quite as important or quite as urgent for those sort of retailers. So, you and I share the common experience of having worked in the moderate department store space many, many years ago. And, as is now blindingly obvious now, but going back 15, 20, 25 years, it was pretty clear that the planet we were living on, or the particular part of the planet we were living on, was going to, at some point, become uninhabitable. And so I like this analogy of thinking about the space you're in, the industry sector, whatever, having characteristics that will make it eventually uninhabitable, not just a little bit inhospitable, but literally not a place you can stay, which means that you don't just want to slowly walk or move to another neighborhood. You need to move to another planet. Now, to be fair, this isn't always easy to see, and I think it gets harder and harder to predict what's coming. So just some real tangible examples of this. A few years ago, virtually nobody was particularly worried about Shein or Temu. Now they've had some issues because of tariff policy, but they're still massive businesses. And that's a U.S. centric issue. Many of our friends in Europe are starting to see Temu and Shein show up, including a store. So, and then, also 3 years ago, we were talking about the metaverse, and 2 years ago, we were talking about Vision Pro. Well, those, haven't turned out to be much of anything, but Gen AI and agentic AI are now, not coming out of left field totally, but are very disruptive forces. So, you can't always figure this out a priori, but the really hard thing to do, and why I think you really have to adopt this blank canvas strategy to try to free yourself of some preconceived notions or old ideas, is to be able to accept, or at least see and then accept, that your situation may grow increasingly dire, and that these incremental changes are not going to save you. So you can either opt for, kind of putting these incremental changes into place, which ultimately may lead to a lingering death. So it just may slow that down. Or you make the decision, or at least to contemplate, that you may need to move to what I call Earth 2, with, as I said earlier, Earth 1 being kind of the current place you occupy. So fundamentally, blank canvas strategy is about articulating what this Earth 2 might look like, and then eventually putting in the steps to get ready to move there, which might be something you need to do super aggressively, or it may be something you can do, as we'll talk about, with a few retailers over 5, 10, 15 years.
It's funny you say that, because that time horizon, because I remember being back at Hudson's Bay and we're like, we're big enough, we could erode shareholder value for decades at this rate. Like, we're not going anywhere. But unfortunately, we're not going anywhere either. And now, the end came 25 years later after I left. Now, as we said, this isn't a how to do it episode, but do you want to touch on, like, it's easier said than done, about recognizing where you are and recognizing that the planet is dying, and you're Romulus. The sun's about to go nova, and you're about to go. That's not always so obvious, right?
Well, this gets to a bunch of things I talk about in my book, Leaders Leap, so I won't go super deep on it. But, part of what I talk about there is creating the space to really see that you need to transform in a very fundamental way. So some of that is crushing our ego. Some of that is doing a lot more work and being more expansive in the work you do, so opening the aperture. Some of that is really to get you and your team to fundamentally rethink some core assumptions you have and challenging the status quo. So yes, it's hard, because I think it really takes courageous leadership. And frankly, it really takes the time and the energy, in some cases the money, to carve out from the day-to-day challenges of the business. And many retailers that are listening to this are dealing with tariffs, they're dealing with consumer confidence, they may be dealing with all sorts of issues. And it's like, well, if I can't figure out the near term, then there is no future, right? So that is a reality. Right. I'm not saying it's easier or it's easy, but it will vary depending on your situation, how much time and energy you need to put at it right now. But I think this spending some time to do it is super helpful. And in many cases, not doing it just basically seals your fate. But to your point, it may take a number of years for things to really get to be totally untenable.
Now, we've mentioned a couple of brands who suffered this fate that we worked for. So just to make sure that everybody knows that we're not the cause of this, it happens to other retailers. What other retailers do you think that you can point to where this incremental strategy was really the death knell for the business?
Well, unfortunately, it's really easy to name a large number of brands that found themselves occupying increasingly uninhabitable territory. And they mostly tried to fix the unfixable and really didn't work at all, or in a very limited fashion, to create this Earth 2 destination. So, it's Blockbuster, Borders, Radio Shack, Sears and Hudson's Bay, as we just talked about, Pier 1, Linens and Things, Joanne Fabrics, Circuit City. I mean, these are all brands that many of our listeners will remember that were huge in the not so distant past, that are essentially completely gone. Then we have a large number of retailers that are still in business, but are way, way smaller and generally not very profitable. So pretty much every department store, most regional malls except the A malls, a lot of the category killers like Toys R Us, Bed Bath & Beyond, the office superstores have lost a tremendous amount of share. So, these were the hit concepts, back in the 90s and now are really shells of their former self. And, in every single one of those cases, despite 15, 20, 25 years of deteriorating performance and lots of evidence that they were living on an uninhabitable planet, they didn't do anything of any real consequence to create this Earth 2, this alternative destination. And so when it became time to, I often talk about the timid trapeze artist, you have to be willing to let go of things sometimes to leap to the other trapeze, right? But if you don't have anything to grasp onto, then you're just falling to your death, not to be too negative about
right.
it. But that is the reality, and it's a hard thing to confront. But unfortunately, we see that over and over and over again.
Well, let's turn our minds to where you can see this being a successful strategy. Let's talk about those who actually do see the broader and bigger and more important changes happening. I mean, let's start with the ones that have disrupted. Actually, let's start with them.
A lot of the new Earth, so to speak, or Earth 2 business models were not created by those that needed to do it to preserve their incredible franchises. A lot of them were in the form of disruptors. So this is the kind of classic innovator dilemma. So you can look at off-price leaders like TJ Maxx and Ross that have stolen incredible amounts of share from department stores. Ulta and Sephora in the beauty space have also transferred, we've talked about this a bunch of times, transferred a tremendous amount of market share from department stores to their new concepts. Very different kind of thing, but Netflix, very different model, obliterating Blockbuster. Amazon obviously has been hugely disruptive, specifically taking out Borders and really hurting Barnes and Nobles. But, almost anybody who was in a more commodity-driven kind of category killer business were either made obsolete or have really struggled quite a lot. Sort of famously across the last decade, a lot of these digitally native vertical brands, the caveat there being, of course, not, many of them have not worked out terribly well. But there are examples like the resale platforms, but, Warby Parker, which have really taken on LensCrafters and Pearl, and Vision Works and some other of the optical players that really haven't had much of a fulsome response. And then, more broadly in retail, if you look at real estate development, new kinds of power centers, neighborhood centers, these kind of Main Street lifestyle centers have been becoming, increasingly powerful, with a lot of the hot brands choosing to go there and leaving many of the malls, not so much the A-quality malls, but, the large number of malls where we used to find a lot of these brands, those malls are going away.
Let's talk about a couple of high-profile examples of what we both describe as a legacy retailer, and we've talked about them before, so these won't come as a surprise to the listeners. Who took more of your blank canvas strategy approach?
Well, to your point, we've talked about some of these. RH, the brand formerly known as Restoration Hardware, I've talked about that a bunch of times, so I probably won't spend any time on it. The one I'd like to spend just a tiny bit of time on, which we haven't talked about too much. We talked about the brand overall as a successful performer, but Dick's Sporting Goods is a very current and I think important example. First of all, as a category killer, we talked about a bunch of these category killers or superstores, whatever you want to call them. Many of them have been quite challenged. So you think about that model, well, they very easily could have been Amazoned or Walmarted or however you want to think about it, because that's happened to just about everybody who is kind of a similar vintage. But what they've done is not only executed quite well in their core business, but they have been developing, in addition to optimizing their Earth 1 model, what I'd like to call an Earth 1 model, an Earth 2 destination. So and it's a bit of a reminder that this is not like an all or nothing black and white proposition. You don't have to get this all done in 2 or 3 years. But what they've been doing first, as a pilot, but now refining and optimizing, is an Earth 2 concept that is called House of Sport. And it's certainly got a fair amount of similarities to their core business model, but it's quite different. First of all, it's more than twice as big as the typical, the Earth 1 Dick's Sporting Goods model. it is much more experiential. So instead of kind of the typical category killer model of low service with just a lot of stuff on shelves, they've got climbing walls, they've got batting cages, places to analyze your golf swing, etc. They've really invested heavily in some key focal points for merchandise. So the shoe departments are like 4 times as big. Footwear departments are like 4 times as big as their core stores. They're really lifting up some of the brand partner as well as your private label brand stories. So I think if you go into a Dick's Sporting Goods, I know if you go into a Dick's Sporting Goods House of Sport, it's a brand new one, just not too far from me, you really see the difference, even though you can see the connection to the core business. The other thing I think is kind of interesting is, like RH is doing in some cases with their gallery store, they're actually going into malls. So instead of kind of the typical strip center next to the TJ Maxx or the Old Navy, they're going into some of these really top mall locations and actually becoming more of an anchor store, which is a smart strategy because they can get that space because so much of it is vacant. But it's also really seeing yourself as a destination store rather than just, one of a whole bunch of places you can go to buy sneakers or running shorts or what have you. So just some numbers on this really quickly. They'll end the year with 35 of these stores. Now that compares to like 800 of their core format, but they'll be opening as many as 100 locations. And of course, because these stores being bigger and more productive, that's a lot more sales per location than their typical store. So I think it's a great example of somebody who says, I'm not necessarily so sure that this category killer model is going to stand me in good stead for the next decade. I need something more exciting, more powerful, more profitable to develop so that I have a place to go before Earth One becomes uninhabitable.
I might throw in one for consideration, and that is Best Buy's and their Best Buy Express stores. It's a Canadian thing, but it's been so successful, and it's funny because it's built on the carcass of some of the brands you said before. So basically, there's a bunch of Radio Shack stores in malls, and that got bought by Bell Canada, who converted it into something called The Source. And then last year, Best Buy did a deal with Bell Canada, and they converted The Source into Best Buy Express. And they've got hundreds of these stores. They're smaller footprint, more focused, and they've been very, very successful. I had the chance to talk to Canadian President Matt Poves on the stage in Vancouver, and it's just been a big winning strategy. So it reminds me less about RH, but more about what Dick's is doing. Let's take a completely different approach and scale it differently. Does that sit with you okay? That's another example of the blank canvas strategy?
I thought about that, and I thought about what IKEA is doing with their design stores. And it's not clear to me whether it's optimizing your business with a real estate portfolio strategy and kind of a house of concepts, or whether they're really saying to themselves, this may be the Earth we need to depart to somewhere down the road. My guess is probably not, but I think, and this gets a little bit more into the how, which, we can come back to at another time. But I will say, you don't always know when you get started how this is going to work out, right? Many things don't work out. Yeah. And so I don't know that you necessarily have to fundamentally say that, our core business is at risk of being extinct in 10 or 15 years. We better do this. Or whether it's like, this is just a way to optimize it, but maybe we'll discover, because things happen over time, that we need another destination. So it gets a little bit to the intent, but I don't think you necessarily have to have that all worked out. I mean, I definitely think if you were Macy's 20 years ago, you absolutely should have been working on an alternative concept that wasn't these small store strategy, or off price, because that clearly was not going to work, I don't think. But, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have experimented with it, because again, you don't always know what's going to work, and you discover things along the way. But yeah, I think there's a lot more into how to go about this. What are the situations where you would want to take certain approaches that, I hope we'll come back to.
Well, this is such a rich topic to mine. We can have an whole podcast based on this whole blank canvas strategy. I think the more I listen to it, and I know you're working on some other materials, so we'll have an opportunity to come back to this, some more details and other aspects in future episodes. But for now, 2 questions before we wrap up. First, what are the major signs you might be living on a potentially uninhabitable planet? We've touched on a little bit of that. And then, what will you need to create an Earth 2 model?
Yeah, we have touched on the other one a little bit. I mean, one is certainly if you can see major disruptive technology on the horizon and it having a massive impact. So, I mean, the most obvious one here would be you didn't have to be a genius to see 20, 25 years ago that e-commerce was a big thing. And if you had a real convenience issue or an assortment issue or a pricing issue, you were very, very vulnerable. So that would be one. And now, with ChatGPT and other kinds of things, that may be some others. For sure, if your total addressable market is contracting and there's no signs that that's going to reverse, so that's the department store example, and that's in some cases the category killer example, that would be another reason. But I think the big one is are you on the wrong place on this relevance differentiation matrix? So you can just imagine mapping out, are you currently highly relevant to your core customers, and do you have a high degree of differentiation? Well, if you're in low relevance and you're in low differentiation, that's what I call the zone of irrelevance. And if you're already there, you better find a way to get out of it. And if that seems untenable, maybe you need to think about a different way of going to market. So that's what I would say. As far as how to do it, I do think some of this is stay curious. Some of this is stay paranoid. You have to do the work to really understand the forces that are changing. That's technology, that's consumer. But a lot of it, is breaking through your denial. Like none of these executives that have found themselves at the helm of these dying businesses probably didn't really understand what was going on, but they spent more time defending the status quo than doing anything exciting. So, I get back to what I said about the trapeze. It's easy to say, yeah, it's hard to do this work, but it's really hard to discover that you've got this burning platform, or, you have to let go of the trapeze or whatever analogy you like, and you have no place to go. So this Earth 2 idea is really, seeing, is it possible you're going to need a place to escape to? And it's starting to build that before you get to a point of desperation. As we talked about earlier, unfortunately, we've just have seen too many companies not have an exciting destination to go to. And for those that are in the middle of a transformation, they haven't articulated an exciting destination, and they don't necessarily have anything that they're starting to work on that could be. So when you talk about the Best Buy scenario or what's going on with IKEA, I don't know that they've concluded that Earth 1 becomes uninhabitable, but they have some other things that minimally could be important defensive moves, that could be important incremental growth opportunities, but does create the option for something you might need 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So anyway, I think this is why I think the work can be hugely important, and for many retailers is extremely urgent. Not every retailer, but I wouldn't be so safe in your assumption that you're going to be fine forever.
Let's talk about something that I struggled with was, as an operating retailer, I had numbers to put up on the board that, right now retailers listening to this are really focused on, Black Friday and holiday and delivering the numbers that keep the payroll going. But, what's your advice on how to step back and how to start prioritizing this kind of discussion? I struggled with, I know we need to do something completely different, but boy, my day's full. So how do you prioritize this? Not everybody's going to have a strategy. Some do, some don't. What's your advice?
Well, I think one of the most important decisions you can make, I'll say just every year for sake of argument, is what % of your budget is an R&D budget. And by that, I mean, really, that longer term research and discovery. And for some, it doesn't need to be much of a percentage. For others, it needs to be a much more significant percentage. And you just have to, do that, because if you don't commit time, energy, attention, and resources to it, it's not likely to get done. It's you don't get around to it kind of thing. So, so the easiest way to think about it is, what are you going to devote to the research, to experiments, longer term experiments, not just like an email test or something. And then at what point do you really need to pile on to those resources? So whether that's hiring a consulting firm or creating a strategy, innovation skill. So that's going to vary, but you have to make an affirmative decision to put some resources against it. You have to make it on your priorities. And, the evidence is overwhelming that the companies that haven't done that are not successful. Like the facts could not be more clear. We can argue about how to best go about it, but not doing it, has very consistently resulted in very bad well, anywhere from existential crises to just, years and years of struggle.
Well, I like your point there, because in my mind, it's both time and treasure, right? We talk about treasure in terms of making a budget for dollars, whether that's internal, external, hiring somebody, whatever. But it's also, even if you hire an external consultant, they just don't sit there, right? You've got to budget the time to manage them, so to speak, or inform them and allow them to do their great work. So I love that you brought that kind of both. You didn't say it this way, but I kind of thought of it as time and treasure budgeting, right? You need to budget for both things.
And eventually I would add a third T, which is talent. Because one thing I think that happens a lot, and I know it happens a lot because I've lived it and seen it firsthand, is, and nothing against our wonderful merchants and our wonderful store operators, but the people that are trying to manage the open to buy and hit their weekly, monthly, quarterly numbers are not necessarily the same people that are going to create this bold new concept where the typical reaction is, isn't that going to cannibalize my existing business? And if we open a house of sport in Addison, Texas, just to use a real live example, isn't that going to cannibalize the Dick's Sporting Goods? That's, the old concept or the core concept that's 6 miles away. Well, yeah. It probably might. But, we're already being cannibalized by the Walmart, the 3 Walmarts and the Amazon and, whatever. So, it's just very hard to create the dynamic with, it's the innovator's dilemma, the defending of the status quo while you're trying to disrupt yourself. So in many cases, you do have to put some degree, obviously, for example, at Dick's or RH, they've got a lot of talent now against those initiatives because they've become so much important. But in the beginning, to get that escape velocity, just to kind of play out the interplanetary thing here a little bit more, to get that escape velocity for your new thing, you often have to put some dedicated focus and certain kind of talent against it. You can't necessarily count. You have to involve your core team, but you can't necessarily count on them to be the innovators.
Yeah. Your last comment reminds me of something Elon Musk said about going to Mars. He said, I don't want to go to Mars and crash into the planet. I want to land in Mars. Anyway, well, listen, it's been a brilliant discussion. I really love this approach. And, what strikes me is even after 11 seasons of doing this together and the time we spend together, that this idea is crystallizing as just a very fresh idea and a great perspective for the listeners. And hopefully it's helpful. So, thanks for doing this, and more to follow. I would say more to follow for this blank canvas strategy in the future. All right, we're back. Let's visit the buzziest news of the week. Things that we think people should be paying attention to. Go first.
Well, I think everything we talk about, we think people should be paying attention to. But this is really the thing that people are talking about, spreading the news a little bit more, or maybe should be. So a couple things. So I didn't put this in the main news of the week because there's maybe a little bit different take on this. JCPenney came out with their earnings. Now they're a little bit behind. What got a lot of coverage on the part of some people were that, wow, maybe they're really gaining some traction in their turnaround because their sales growth was less bad, much like we talked about with Kering, still quite negative. And their profits were improving in some metrics, like apparently there's a bit of an uptick in traffic. And so maybe this portends a turnaround. I know that people complain often that I'm way too cynical about the department store sector, and I'm willing to take any bets that I will ultimately be proven to be right, that JCPenney will not make any sort of miraculous turnaround. But I actually, and I guess I say this for two reasons. One is, let's not lose sight of, it's not uncommon just mathematically for things like sales decreases to improve because your base continues to decrease and you're basically left with your most loyal customers. So some of that is just the way averages end up working over time. So that's one reason not to get super excited about it. But the other reason not to get super excited about it is it's their relative gap with their competition continues to widen. So if you think about the degree to which Amazon, Walmart, Costco, TJ Maxx, all these other guys have stolen share from the department store guys over the last 2 decades, basically, those competitors are still growing at 4, 5, 6%, while JCPenney is only down 3%. But the gap continues to widen. So the challenge of winning sales back is continuing to get greater. It's just not quite as humongous as it was at this time last year. So anyway, I just don't, as I often say now, kind of tongue in cheek, Shania Twain, that strategist, that don't impress me much. So anyway, but I do want to just very, very quickly tie it back to what we just finished talking about, the blank canvas strategy. Pennies is a great example, and I know this from my Sears days way back in the 90s, of a company that has been in trouble for a long time. It has lost a tremendous, it's almost incalculable, the amount of market share they have lost. And at no time during 15, 20, 25 years of very negative trends, and it becoming very obvious that the center of gravity for moderate apparel and home shopping was moving off the mall, did they do anything of any consequence? So their Earth One, their current place, was clearly becoming uninhabitable over a period of time. There's still clearly a business there. But, when we just finished talking about, looking at where you are in the relevance and differentiation matrix, they're in a very poor place.
Now, a question for you about JCPenney, and maybe this was a failed attempt to get to Earth 2, or maybe this was a giant meteor that wound up hitting the business. But at one point, I think of JCPenney and their attempt to change their whole pricing structure, the Ron Johnson era, where they decided to go everyday low pricing. How do you see that in the lens of the blank canvas strategy? That's arguably fairly radical. But it wasn't really changing the footprint of the approach of the core business. How do you interpret that?
No, when I think about a business model, it's who's your target customer and what's your go-to-market strategy. There was no change. Anything Ron Johnson did, there were, tactical changes, but it did not fundamentally change the business model design, which is a mall-based department store going after the peak of the bell curve sort of customers. So that might have helped them a little bit. But, we made a lot of change, not to get into a history lesson here, but we made a lot of fairly radical changes at Sears during my time there. But we did not change the fundamental business model, which is why so much, we lost to Home Depot, Lowe's, and Best Buy, basically. So, yeah, those are more radical changes, but it did not fundamentally change the planet they were living on. It changed, the neighborhood or whatever. I don't want to overplay the analogy too much.
Right. No, that's a good articulation, because I think that helps to continue to articulate, or so to speak, to illustrate the concept, right? So thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that. From my perspective, have we hit finally a tipping point with IoT, RFID devices in retail? We've seen them used selectively in places, mono brands like Uniqlo for that kind of self-checkout and their inventory management. Walmart announces a huge move, put millions and millions and millions of these little ambient supply chain monitoring devices, 90 million pallets eventually. They're the first, and they're also one of the first to adopt Avery Dennison's RFID for their meat, fresh solutions in the deli department. Shout out to our friend Marshall Kay. Anyway, so I thought we kind of maybe hit some tipping points. Like, this has been long talked about. They're going to spend millions and millions of dollars, and when Walmart moves, many, many others follow, because they also lower the price of getting in for everybody else, because they just buy so much of everything, right? So that's what caught my attention this week. Let's move to what's on our radar screen, what we're paying attention to, or should be paying attention to, that's around the corner.
I mean, to me, and this is very U.S.-centric, but of course the ripple effects can go outside of the U.S. The government shutdown continues. Again, this is a little bit of a risk of things perhaps shifting by the time people listen to this, but there really doesn't seem to be much near-term hope on the horizon of bringing this to a close. I think the impacts are starting to be more broadly felt. Some folks may have seen these pictures of government employees at food banks and things like that. So as paychecks don't come out, as contractors don't get paid, et cetera, the economic impact, so therefore the impact on retail, could become more pronounced. So I don't have a lot of new things to say about it, other than as the passage of time, this could be much more significant. The other thing I'll mention, which at the risk of veering into politics, I'm increasingly worried just about the tensions in the United States and the kind of volatility or risks more broadly
So as I mentioned in the introduction, I was in the Big Apple this week, and I was walking in Soho with our good friend Jim Okamura, and we came across GU. Do you know GU? GU.
Yeah.
I call it GU because
a little bit,
I do
not
tend
a lot,
to mispronounce. Anyway, I was totally unaware that's their first store in America, it turns out. So they're the Japanese discount casual wear manufacturer. They are a division of Uniqlo, which, again, I did not know. It's their first store in America. It's just down from the Aritzia store right on the main drag there in Soho. So I walked in. The product looked fabulous. The prices were eye-poppingly good. And there is a real buzz in the room. So anyway, watch for that. Watch this space.
Something to check out. Yeah. You managed to get us with a more uplifting story. So your job, it's very Canadian for you to be the positive guy and very, American for me to be the negative guy. So.
Well, let's end on the Go Jays or Go Dodgers, whoever you're rooting for. I'm a real bandwagon jumper. I don't really care either, other than the Jays are in it. So anyway, best of luck to all the people who are enjoying some fun and just the fun of sport to take our minds off whatever else is happening in our lives. So congratulations to both of them, and best of luck to the Dodgers not winning. Anyway, so let's leave it there. Great episode, and we'll be back next week with more guests. We got some great, fantastic guests coming up to wrap the season, and excited about our time at NRF. More about that later.
Thanks for tuning in. To help more retail leaders discover the industry's leading podcast, please drop us that 5-star rating and review on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you enjoy your pods. And for more on my strategic advisory services, keynote speaking, best-selling books, and even more retail industry insights, go to stephenpdennis.com.
If you are a brand or service provider looking to take your influence to the next level, reach out to us for sponsorship, advertising, or event partnerships. And if you want to learn more about my own keynote speaking and advisory practice, reach out to me via LinkedIn.